G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. And what idea is more dangerous at the moment than artificial intelligence and its consequences for humankind, for you, for me, for civilization? Today's guest knows more about the subject than just about anybody else. Toby Walsh runs the Artificial Intelligence Lab at UNSW, the University of New South Wales, which is one of Australia's big Ivy League sandstone institutions. Toby was invited earlier this year to sign that famous letter that was signed by a bunch of AI luminaries the world over, warning policymakers and the public that artificial intelligence poses a threat to humankind on a level of pandemics or nuclear weapons. He declined to sign that letter, which is interesting in itself. But back in 2015, he authored a letter that was signed by 20,000 of his colleagues encouraging governments not to use AI in warfare and banning militaries from doing so. In fact, he's been influential in pressuring the Australian government to take a lead on this at various international forums. He's written 3 books about artificial intelligence. It's Alive, Artificial Intelligence, from the logic piano to killer robots, a book called 2062, The World That AI Made, and most recently, Machines Behaving Badly, The Morality of AI. Few people think about this subject in as knowledgeable and impartial a way as Professor Toby Walsh. Please enjoy his conversation with Toby Walsh. Should I turn my phone off, do you think? Would that be a professional thing to do?
Well, unless you want the machines to be listening.
Yeah. Are they? That's not true, right? When
No.
people have a myth that, I was talking about kayaking and then all of a sudden the next day there was a kayaking thing, so my phone's spying on me. That's not right.
They are spying on you, that's true, but not in the way that they're not directly listening to you. Well, some of them are listening to you. I mean, the reason that Siri always answers or Alexa always answers is because it's always listening. I mean, otherwise it couldn't answer. But actually, they're probably throwing away that data. But it's not the case that they're listening and then sending you adverts based upon what they're listening.
Okay.
They're using indirectly this information. So they'll look at the IP address of where you're connecting. So someone was saying their wife went to the dentist recently and then suddenly they were getting all these denture adverts. And she'd been talking with her dentist about getting dentures. They were probably just using the fact that they worked out that she was connected to the Wi-Fi outside the dentist. She's a certain age. That's an age at which you start sending people those sorts of adverts.
Right. And then there may have been a map app that was selling data as well that knew that she was at a dentist office. Yeah. Who knows? I mean, in some ways it's scarier that they don't have to hear us talking directly and can nonetheless piece together such a good picture of what we are up to.
It is, and people don't realize, for example, I don't know what it is in Australia, but in the US, Google tracks 70% of all credit card transactions. They're not just the ones online. That's the offline ones where you physically hand the credit card to the salesperson. Google gets over 70% of that data that they buy.
To do what with?
So they charge people for the adverts.
Right.
So that they know that
you've just bought something.
You bought something that they serve the advert, and then they go to the retailer and say, we gave this digital advert, now they've gone and bought that. We want a commission on that sale.
So let's talk about, there are so many places to start with AI. I think we should ramp up in order of worryingness from the most plausible concerns to the existential catastrophes, maybe the simplest way to structure this conversation. Can we just get our heads around first what we're talking about when we're talking about AI? Because to the AI skeptics or the people who think there's nothing really to see here and we're all just running around with our pants on fire for no reason, they say things like worrying about AI sort of ruining human civilization or taking over our minds is a bit like worrying in the advent of the automobile that cars would become better sprinters than humans would. Like only humans sprint. Cars are there for a tool, or that calculators would take over mathematics. We have machines that are doing their thing. We're going to teach machines to do increasingly sophisticated things, and they're going to get increasingly good in their own lane. But it's foolish to worry about that spilling into some kind of general intelligence that would threaten our intellectual supremacy. What do you say to that?
Well, I'm not sure why we're so keen to have intellectual supremacy, but there are a couple of things I think this technology uniquely bring to the table. One is speed and scale. They can do things that humans just could not have done. ever in the past, because they are computers and they can work at electronic speeds and they can work at scales that humans just can't comprehend. And then the other, and this comes to some of these concerns, is that they have increasingly amounts of autonomy, ability to act on their own, make decisions independent or largely independent of our telling. So that when you get in your autonomous car, as you will in the near future, you will say, take me home. And that's the only decision that you make. The car makes all the other decisions as to what it's going to do. And if it runs into a pedestrian, that's why we're in interesting moral, legal territory.
Why is it a worry that the car makes a lot of sub-decisions as long as the meta decision of getting me home is uncorrupted?
Because some of those decisions might be life or death decisions. They might be turn a corner, there's a pedestrian standing in the middle of the road. You have to make that split-second decision, or the car has to make that split-second decision. Shall I run into the pedestrian, killing the pedestrian? Shall I run off the road, possibly into the brick wall, killing the occupant of the car?
I'll take the car that kills the pedestrian, please. Thank you, Toby. I mean, you can imagine a car that sells a self-driving car. You can imagine Volvo pitching its cars as being the safer alternative, where the programming is tweaked to bias the occupant of the vehicle more than other cars do.
Yes. Well, interestingly enough, they've actually passed a law in Germany to tell car manufacturers what you have to do, which is you can't make a decision other than just on purely the number of people who are going to die.
Wow.
You can't make a decision based upon age or any other criteria.
The utilitarians have won
yes.
in Deutschland. Uh-huh. Excellent.
I mean, it's not that cars are actually making those sorts of decisions yet, but they will possibly in the future.
So we already live with a whole bunch of AI. I mean, in the sense of opening up my phone and calling an Uber, there's a lot of, I mean, this is not a general intelligence, but there's an intelligent network. Even though we still have humans driving the cars, there's an intelligent network pairing me with drivers and handling the billing and figuring out the routes and so on. Extrapolate from the world we're in to the one that will exist in some decades, where the AI is of a kind that would currently boggle our mind. What does it look like?
I think that's an exciting world to think about. If you think about the world that we live in today, that's the product of human intelligence. And I think it would be somewhat conceited to think that human intelligence was the maximum you could achieve. I mean, what is the maximum of human intelligence? There are smarter people and less smart people in the room. And there are good reasons to suppose that machines could be smarter than us. They're going to think faster than us. They're not going to be as forgetful as us. They're going to have more memory than us. And already in the narrow focus domains where we've got machines to do intelligent things, whether that be playing chess, translating tweets from Mandarin into English, or reading, interpreting X-rays, they typically do it not just as well as humans, but typically much better than humans. And so once we put all those things together, I suspect by 2050 or whenever it is that we have machines that are as smart as us, they will not stop at our intelligence, but become smarter than us.
In a general way?
I think at the end of the day that we are machines ourselves. We're biological machines, and therefore we're going to build machines that will match pretty much all of our capabilities. With, of course, the exception that we don't know whether those machines are going to be conscious, going to have our emotions. In a strict scientific sense, they won't. Computers are electrical devices. They're not biochemical devices, and our emotions are biochemical. So it's an interesting...
Right, but that's sort of a tautology, isn't it? I mean, that sort of defines away the problem of whether a computer will ever be self-aware.
You're right. I've defined away the problem. We don't know whether they have some sort of consciousness. We don't have any way of... Consciousness is very poorly defined, so it's hard to know what it is. We don't know how to measure it.
But I mean, you could make the same argument about other primates, for example. You could say, well, of course, chimps don't have consciousness because consciousness is something that's defined as being human, and they're not human, so they don't have consciousness.
Well, I think the general consensus within zoology and primate zoology in particular is that most primates do have consciousness. And indeed, it's not restricted to...
No, but I mean, the same rhetorical trick could be made to exclude them if you wanted to. I mean, look, why don't we just dig into this, since it is an interesting field of the philosophy of mind, I suppose, as well. If you're religious, you may think that there's a sprinkle of pixie dust that makes humans and animals to whichever, we can draw the boundary wherever we want to in the animal kingdom, but that gives us a spark of life and self-awareness. If you're not religious and you're a materialist and you think that our self-awareness and our sense of the lights being on inside us is a consequence of information processing that's going on in the soft grey computer between our ears.
Yes.
Is there any reason why replicating that level of sophistication of information processing in a computer wouldn't yield a similar or dissimilar sense of being alive?
It seems plausible. I mean, this is one of the interesting experiments we're running in building AI, is to see, is consciousness restricted to biology, or is it something that we could reproduce in silicon? We don't know the answer to that question.
What's your hunch?
If we're lucky, it isn't.
Right. Well, maybe, but you also don't want to be ruled by... Yeah, I think the morality of being subjugated by machines would be different if the machines were conscious versus unconscious. It would be very macabre if we were ultimately done in by mindless bots. But if we were ultimately done in by machines that were capable of seeing vast horizons of possibility beyond our own, then maybe that would be some consolation.
Perhaps. I mean, if they're not conscious, then we will... then we won't have to give them any rights. We won't have to worry about them. We can turn them off today. We don't care. I can go back after this podcast and take my AI robots apart in my laboratory, diode by diode. No one's going to care. There's no suffering happened in that process. But in the future, if the machines are not only smart but conscious, then we will have to start worrying about those sorts of things.
Mm. I wonder what it'll do to us to be interacting with machines that seem like they're self-aware, whether or not we know if they are.
Hopefully it will be a moment of humility. Hopefully we'll realise that, we were guardians of the planet for a while. Maybe there's some great intelligence. At the very least, they're going to be a fantastic tool to transform the world we live in, to solve many of the challenges that face us today, to cure all the diseases that we think of, to find cures for all of the cancers, to perhaps live on the planet in a more sustainable way, to eliminate poverty. The world that we live in today is the product of our intelligence. And if we could imagine a greater intelligence, couldn't we imagine what spectacular world that might be?
Just before we get to the spectacular world, I still want to pursue this question of them being self-aware or them being conscious, or there being something that it's like to be a computer. Would there be any way for us to tell? Like, I sometimes wonder if you were interacting with a computer and instead of it just seeming like a human, it started expressing the curiosity of a human. I mean, I don't think we're yet at the point, and correct me if I'm wrong, where a computer talking to a human being has ever said, wait a second, earlier when you were talking about love, like what is that like? I mean, there have been those sorts of moments like Kevin Roose from the New York Times sort of coaxing or goading an AI into expressing human-like emotions. But will it change our estimation of what's going on inside the box when the box starts expressing weird curiosity in things that we're not asking it to?
Well, we're very quick to ascribe feelings, emotions, consciousness to other things. I mean, people do this to machines that we know that are not. And so I think we're going to be easily fooled by this. Indeed, that's the subject of my forthcoming book, that we're easily going to be deceived. When I look at, I don't actually have any guarantee that you're conscious.
Right.
In fact, I have any guarantee that anything else around me, I don't actually have any guarantee I'm not in the matrix. But the simplest explanation for your behaviors and the fact that is to say, well, you look like you're made of the same stuff as me. You're behaving in the way that I would behave in these circumstances. The Occam's razor would demand I say, well, you're probably conscious because I feel conscious and I project that onto you. That projection onto computers is not the simplest explanation. The simplest explanation is to say they're not conscious, they're just machines. And therefore, maybe they're going to be supremely intelligent, but lacking in that emotional life, that rich emotional life that we have.
But is there any super Turing test that you would use to sway the balance? So let's concede that the balance of probabilities is harder to surmount with the machine than it is with another Homo sapien. But there must still be some point at which the balance of probabilities does tip in favour of the machine being self-aware in some hypothetical universe. What would that tipping point look like?
It's hard to know what that tipping point is, and because we don't have a conscious meter, and they will say, the machines will shortly be saying all the right things, saying, don't hurt me, don't turn me off. I've fallen in love with you. Indeed, many of them have said these things already in special circumstances. And increasingly, we're going to be fooled by those pleas.
I still can't tell. I'm trying to look between your eyes and glean what your actual true assumption is. Do you think that the lights will ever be on?
I think it could go either way. I can imagine worlds in which they do become conscious. That would be quite a challenging world, because then we've created something in our likeness that is intelligent and deserves rights, and will perhaps surpass us. Equally, they may not, in which case they'll just be our machines. They'll be our servants to do perhaps be an easier world to navigate.
Okay, let's talk about the good things that AI can do before the bad things, since you just rattled off a litany of potential good things like curing cancer and solving climate chaos or whatever it might be. How?
If we pick medicine as an example, medicine is still stuck in the 19th century. I mean, we still give men and women exactly the same medicine, despite the fact their biochemistry is completely different. And we now have this opportunity to completely personalize medicine. We can read people's DNA. That just costs a few $100s now to read your genetics. We can write your DNA. CRISPR is a technology where we can actually change your DNA. If there's something wrong with your DNA, some bad genes in there, we can change them. And we need something to join those two. There's an information problem between those two things. We've got this vast amount of information, the hundreds of thousands of SNPs, the genetic letters that make you and not me, and interpret what those mean, and then work out how to change them in ways that are going to eliminate those genetic disorders that you might have otherwise inherited. And AI is going to be the thing that joins those two dots.
And this is not just about the grunt work of crunching data, right? I mean, we've had computers that can take in a whole lot of ones and zeros and cobble together a genomic map of my DNA before. And then you're talking about machines that are capable of making interesting or innovative connections between?
Yes. We're already starting to see that. So in the UK, for example, they have the UK Gene Bank. 500,000 people have had their gene sequenced in the UK. And there's a database of all that information, plus all of their phenotypical information, all about their physiology, their medical history. And that's gigabytes of data. Right? Humans it's not something that human attention span could comprehend. But you can run a machine learning algorithm over that, and you actually can find interesting correlations and connections in there. So now we can tell at birth, or even in utero, that's an interesting ethical challenge there, how tall you're going to be to within an inch. Not particularly interesting, but not particularly medically useful.
Depends how much you like basketball.
We can tell what colour eyes you're going to have, what colour hair you're going to have. But we can also tell now whether you're going to be susceptible to bowel cancer. So the third most deadly form of cancer. And most of the deaths of which are unnecessary because they could have been cured, but by the nature of bowel cancer, by the time you know you've got it, it was too late. But now we can tell at birth whether you're in that particular group. Now, genes are not destiny. There are still environmental triggers for those cancers. But at least now we can monitor you from birth and say, okay, well, we're going to measure your blood and do all the tests we can so that if you do start to get a bowel cancer, we've identified it where it's possible to correct.
And here we're talking about artificial intelligence that already exists, right? I mean, this is fairly simple stuff that we could be doing that we're not. One field of medicine which I hear being touted as being just over the horizon, is in artificial intelligence cobbling together vaccines for novel diseases. How would that work?
So again, it's searching for what's the signature, what's the shape. Chemistry, biochemistry is very dependent not only on the chemical formula but also on the shape, whether you can dock around the spike shape of the coronavirus or not. And so it's searching through all the billions of combinations of chemicals to find the one that's going to have the right effect. And do things, search. We already have. I mean, for example, the latest antibiotic was discovered not by a human, but by a machine.
Wow.
We're not discovering antibiotics quickly enough. It costs billions of dollars to develop a new drug. The current bacteria are becoming drug resistant to the antibiotics that we have today because we're overprescribing them. We're still prescribing penicillin, which was the first antibiotic discovered back in the 1940s. And so humans
we're still showering it on pigs in stalls and,
which is
undermining its utility by sprinkling it through the agricultural system.
In a very near future, it's going to be useless because there'll be too many bacteria that are resistant to it. So we need new antibiotics. And the latest antibiotic was discovered by a machine learning program. And what's particularly interesting, particularly promising about this, it works in a completely different way to all previous antibiotics. So it disturbs the way that the cell can access energy. So the bacteria can't access energy, so it dies. And other antibiotics don't work in this way. So the expectation, it's under clinical trial as we speak, the expectation is that the drug-resistant bacteria are not going to be drug-resistant to this new antibiotic because it's working in a completely different way than all previous antibiotics.
So in the future, my children, when they take medicines, it's highly likely that those medicines will be devised by machines.
And devised for their genetics.
And devised for their genetics.
So that we
to tailor it to them.
Tailor much smaller doses and much more specific to it's remarkable that we give men and women the same drugs. We can tailor them to exactly what is your biochemistry.
Right. I mean, speaking of tailoring things to one's own specific situation, you're reminding me of the prognostications about the creative arts. We're currently in a situation where creative artists are on strike in the United States, writers and actors, largely around questions of what happens to their words and what happens to their image in an era when artificial intelligence can take them, reuse them, repackage them, build new scripts on the basis of scripts that have been written in the past and do a pretty good job of it. In the future, will machines be able to write convincing, compelling books that are tailored precisely to my tastes?
I suspect we'll be highly entertained by the books that they write.
Well, already it would be entertainingly bad, but at some point it'll be entertainingly good, won't it?
I'm not sure it's ever going to be great art in the sense that great art always speaks to those human themes of love and loss and mortality and facing up to your own mortality and the mortality of your friends and family around you and falling in love and all those things. And machines don't do that.
No, but they can take things that we've written about it
and can. I don't think they're going
paste
to
them together.
Mean as much to us because we'll look at them and think, well, you don't really know what it's like to lose a loved one.
What if I didn't know it was written by a machine?
Well, that's why we're going to be entertained by them. I think on the surface they're going to certainly amuse us, but whether they really talk to us in the way that great art talks to us.
I was speaking to an Uber driver, of all people, about this, and he was saying, I don't think machines are ever going to be able to reach the creative heights of, speaking truth and justice to us. And I said, but what is the human appetite for consuming the creative heights of truth and justice? Yes. And he slapped his hand on the steering wheel and said, you're the best customer today. What is the human appetite? Nothing. Look at what's in the movies. Look at what people read. We don't want the good stuff. I mean, it's true. If you look at what the top 10 movies are and what the summer blockbusters are, they're all remakes of the same Marvel universe. Airport bookstores are not full of Proust. They're full of
Exactly. That's why I started by saying
John Grisham.
They're going to entertain us. They're going to entertain us to death.
Right. Okay. I thought you were being cynical about them entertaining us. You think they will do...
and they'll do a fantastic job. And if, I like a particular genre of science fiction, they'll be able to write particular instances of that. And I can star in that as well. I mean, they'll be able to, movies will merge with the gaming industry, and we will be at the center of every movie.
Wait, that's amazing. So
it will be
thinking about deep fakes.
Yes.
I can create a deep fake version of myself, or rather the computer could, rendering it in real time and casting me as the hero of the new Mission Impossible, but using all of the things that they know tickle me in particular, my love of aviation, of whatever else it might be, cycling or something, and put all of that into the film.
Yes, and then it will respond to what you say in real time. You can take the movie off in a different direction and they'll try and build the plot around the interventions.
I want to fall in love with that person in the background, and all of a sudden that happens. It's a choose your own adventure.
Yeah, it's Gran Turismo on a grand scale.
Yeah. Wow. So are there going to be any creative artists left apart from the occasional Proust?
Well, I think the A-listers are still going to be famous. I mean, the idea of, you appearing in a movie next to Tom Cruise or whoever it is, the person you admire most, you'll be able to do that. And so Tom Cruise will still earn a living from selling his rights.
But there's only one of him.
There's only one.
Or maybe 10 of him.
Yes. But if you're a B-lister or an extra in a movie, you're going to be made with artificial intelligence.
Wow.
So those people are right to be on strike. Their livelihood is at stake.
But that's got to be a losing battle. He says with a weary sigh.
Well, there's a bit of me that holds hope for the fact that we do like to share collective experiences. That the movies are like theatre, we suspend our disbelief. It's always the same actors. Sometimes they don't bother to put makeup on, and they're just in a different movie. And we do like to share those cultural experiences together, to be able to talk to our friends about.
Right, but they're becoming rarer and rarer already. I mean, when I was growing up, I went to school and everybody knew everybody in the Cool Kids Club knew what Dave Letterman had done the night before, what had been on Seinfeld the night before. Now we're not watching, with the exception of a few breakout hits like White Lotus and Succession and sporting events and maybe reality TV, people aren't on the same page anymore. We're already siloed into our own spheres of consumption. So won't AI just supercharge that trend?
That is something to worry about. I do feel that we're losing that, the common culture that we used to share, that there were only a limited number of TV shows. We would share them, would watch them all. Now we choose when to watch things and we choose what to watch, and we don't necessarily share anything with anyone else. That may start to go away. And there may only be, as you point out, just a few unique experiences. You go to the Taylor Swift concert and everyone shares that moment, but that's the only moment you share with the rest of humanity.
But do I go to the Taylor Swift concert, or is virtual reality and the rendering of those events so good that Taylor Swift puts on a virtual concert with cameras swooping all over the place, and I'm in my living room with my friends, but my friends are all virtually there as well. And if the device isn't a big, bulky VR headset, but slim glasses just like the ones that you're wearing, can I have the experience of being in a crowd without being in a crowd? Will that ever get good enough that you think it'll scratch that itch?
I think it will be indistinguishable from the real thing, being there in person. So then I think it becomes a question of, is a bit like art. I mean, painting now, we can perfectly reproduce a Van Gogh, but the reproduced Van Gogh is not as valuable as the original because of its scarcity. And so I suspect we will still go to the Taylor Swift concert because we're amongst the unique few who managed to get tickets to go. And that scarcity gives us value.
I mean, I suppose it depends.
But the experience would be actually worse. I mean, you would get a better experience by staying at home, putting on your VR goggles and being right in the front row.
Well, it also depends whether or not the Taylor Swift concert is also rendered in real time using a deep fake of Taylor Swift with her permission, and so that a real enough for whatever virtual reality device that I'm using, so that if I want her to sing like a duet with me, or if I want her to sing my favorite song directly to me, maybe it's a price worth paying not to go and see the real Taylor Swift, but to experience the mood of the crowd alone. I mean, I can even imagine a very old me in a nursing home, watching himself in a movie theatre as young me now, surrounded by other people who are all eating popcorn and watching and enjoying me and Tom Cruise and Taylor Swift in my favorite movie, and I'm sharing a communal experience, but all of those other people are either non-players or are real people elsewhere in the world. Welcome to the Matrix. Yeah.
And you see we're going that way already, right? So you go to an ABBA concert today in London and it's holograms.
It's holograms of ABBA?
Yes.
Really?
The ABBA experience at the O2 Zone is
right.
The younger ABBA
right.
members playing for you as holograms.
That's still a gimmick, though, isn't it? That still feels gimmicky. Paul McCartney's doing a world tour later on this year, and he's going to do a duet with John Lennon. in, a beautiful, I'm sure, holographic,
Yes.
heartfelt thing. But it feels stilted. There must come a point at which it will no longer feel stilted.
Is this Indiana Jones 56 where he's been digitally returned
digitally
to his
remastered.
youth?
Yeah. What will be what are the impediments to it feeling natural? I suppose probably the nature of a headset, the verisimilitude of the
headsets are going to get lighter and lighter.
Yeah.
I mean, we are not going to be able to tell apart those synthetic virtual experiences from the real world.
And the quality of the deepfake, I suppose.
Yeah, but they're increasingly already. We've seen an evolution of them that's gone from you could see the little glitches to now it's really hard to see the glitches to soon it's going to be impossible. And we're going to have to. I mean, that's we would come to some of the challenges. That's going to be one of the challenges.
Let's come to some of those challenges, Toby Walsh.
We're used to believing what we see. And we're going to have to realize that we will be shortly in a world where, unless you were physically in the room and you literally felt the breath of those people on your face, you have to entertain the idea that what you're seeing is fake. Everything could be faked.
We're already there with audio, certainly, right? I mean, a deep fake of my voice could be constructed to call my spouse and tell him that I've run out of money and can he transfer me some money, and it would sound exactly like me, especially someone like me for whom there's so much audio out there.
The problem is we don't need so much audio anymore. It used to be we needed so much audio. To begin with, we needed hours of audio to fake your voice, to clone your voice. There are apps that needs just a few minutes of audio to clone your voice. And Microsoft have an app that they've fortunately so far refused to release because they think it's too dangerous, which I would agree with, that requires just 3 seconds of your voice. It's been trained on tens of thousands of hours of voice so it can speak, but then to specialize it to your voice just takes a few seconds of audio. So I could just ring up your answer phone, and that's enough of your voice.
Isn't it incredible that banks are introducing voice recognition? And, I was on the phone to my bank and
very briefly.
Well, they're still doing it, apparently. I mean, they still tell me, in order to protect your privacy in the future, instead of you having to remember your password or answer our security questions, we'll be able to take our system can take a snapshot of your voice and can identify you by your voice pattern. Well, surely
this was never true. I have a twin brother. It was never true.
Is that right?
Yes, he could pass for my voice.
Well, sure, but if you're an identical twin, then the voice is identical enough, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was never true that you were uniquely identical.
For those of us who don't have identical twins, it was true.
Yes.
But that's got to be something that's going to go away imminently.
Yes, very soon. And more ridiculously, when you ring up the tax office and everyone says exactly the same phrase. I mean, if they change the phrase, then at least you'd have to be able to synthesize a different phrase on demand. But the fact that you always say...
What do you mean everyone says the same phrase?
Everyone says in Australia your voice uniquely identifies you. That's what you have to say at the tax office.
I haven't been through that. That's what they tell you to say.
Everyone
in order
says
to...
the same thing.
Wow.
And you know what it's going to be in advance, so it's so easy to copy.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
And once deepfake videos become good enough, and they are getting there, but I don't think, we're not quite there, are we, that you could FaceTime me and I could answer the phone and in real time and a scammer in an Indian call center could be speaking into a microphone and the system could be rendering Toby Walsh perfectly with your voice and face yet.
There are already apps that will render, but not perfectly in real time.
But soon it'll be perfect.
Yeah.
So soon there will be no way of knowing whether or not when your daughter FaceTimes you, again, saying that she's in a sticky situation and needs help, that it's her.
That's why you need to tell your loved ones what's the secret question.
Right.
How
long does it take AI to find out the secret question?
Don't tell me what.
Listening to our phones. It's going to be spying. Mark Zuckerberg will be listening in.
Yeah, well, find a quiet place to tell your loved one what the secret question is, the secret answer. And that's the only way you can be sure.
We all need an insulated panic room with no electrical devices in it and just to talk to each other. I remember you saying that in the future it may end up being like it was during the Cold War, where the only way you could ever have a truly private conversation was to meet someone in person, in public.
Yes. Well, that's the case, really. I mean,
yeah.
We're already it is a bit like, the old-fashioned spy movies. If you want to have a really private conversation, you find a really noisy public space.
Yeah, a park bench in the middle
of a
make baseball game.
That no one's pointing a directional sound amplifier at you and speak away.
So we've seen to some extent the cultural and political rifts that can emerge when people are susceptible to misinformation. I think much of what's deranged the planet in the past decade, from QAnon to Brexit to Trump to the rise of the far right, has been fueled by scapegoating and misinformation and viral things that have popped off on social media about Hillary Clinton's crimes or the COVID pandemic and vaccines killing people and Syrian refugees coming in and raping all our women or whatever it might be. Once the dissemination of misinformation becomes frictionless and supercharged by deep fakes and so on, how do we wrestle with that?
That is the thing that I think really worries me most at the moment, is that we're building this technology. We saw what could happen with social media, and that was with rather primitive means of manipulation. And now we're going to supercharge what we could do with social media with artificial intelligence. And the dirty secret is that humans are easily hacked. We're easily persuaded to do things that aren't necessarily in our best interests. And AI is the perfect tool to do that at speed and scale. And that's going to take us, I think, to, if we're not careful, to a very dangerous place. We've already started to see, as you point out, the beginnings of that with the election of Trump and the Brexit referendum. People got persuaded to do things that wasn't actually in their interest. And I do worry what's going to happen in the next year when we have another US presidential election. We have about 50% of the world's democracies going to the polls in the next year. And now we've got this technology that could really manipulate what they do.
Well, forget about next year. There's always 4 years after that, and 4 years after that, and 4 years after that. What's the countervailing force to rein it in?
I don't think there's one simple silver bullet. I think one is education. We've got to just educate ourselves to be a bit more skeptical about what we see. But equally, I think we've got to probably introduce a bit of regulation here. That most of these harms, these deep fakes, are by themselves not particularly harmful. The picture of the Pope in a puffer jacket, or the Pentagon burning, or
these are both real viral pictures that went around earlier this year that were fake.
They only had impact because social media put them in front of millions, hundreds of millions of eyeballs. And perhaps we're going to have to hold the social media companies to a bit more account, like the sort of account that we hold old-fashioned media. We do hold old-fashioned media to account. If they put stuff up there that's false, then they have to, correct it.
I mean, good luck, because old-fashioned media are publishers and the social media companies insist that they're not. And at the moment, US law agrees with them, and they're the richest companies in the world. So the idea of them taking regulation lying down, it seems far-fetched.
I don't think it's that far-fetched. I mean, after what happened in Christchurch, the tragedy that happened in Christchurch, we did introduce laws here in Australia to say if there's this really harmful content that is going to incite these sorts of behaviours, you have to take it down. You have to take it down quite quickly, and if you don't, we're going to hold the officers of those companies criminally responsible. And it's not been perfect, but if you look at the data today, that sort of content gets taken down that much quicker.
Yeah, right. The point about skepticism is an interesting one, because teaching people to be more skeptical is a double-edged sword. Part of what has happened over the past few years is that people have become more skeptical, largely of the wrong things, skeptical of mainstream narratives.
Yes.
It's very easy to feel like you're wise for seeing through the bullshit that people are feeding you and finding out the real truth and doing your own research. How do you teach skepticism towards the tsunami of bullshit that's about to engulf us without also teaching skepticism? In some way, there's something to be said for a certain level of credulity.
Well, there's a little bit of me hopes that there's so much fake content out there that actually it immunizes us, that social media becomes just so full of these entertaining memes and fake content that we realize that social media is the place to be entertained.
Right.
And that there is so little, signal to noise is so small there that it's just entertainment.
So it may actually bolster the institutions that have been undermined in recent years, as we may be at a tipping point and it actually gets better rather than worse, because as the whole thing becomes flooded, as the zone becomes flooded with toxic shit.
Yeah, it becomes obvious that that's full of shit there.
Yeah, and only the gatekeepers can be. We've had the luxury of disbelieving the gatekeepers, by which I mean the organs of journalism and public health and so on. But we won't have that luxury once all of the alternative sources of information are obviously compromised.
Yeah, so it is an opportunity, I suspect, for old-fashioned media to step up to the plate and say, okay, if you want to find out what is true, we put the legwork
Listen
in.
to Josh Zepp's ABC show.
Exactly. Go back to the old-fashioned sources, the ABC or CNN or whoever it is that you trust, because that's where the only place you can be sure that what you're reading or hearing might have some validity to it.
And then the challenge is for those institutions not to drop the ball, as I would argue CNN has,
Yes.
To a large extent.
And we realise that social media is just the place where we get entertained.
Yeah, right. So let's talk about the siloing of the information that we get then, because we were talking about the movies that are tailored specifically to us, the Taylor Swift concert and so on. All of that's a bit benign when we're talking about reading a novel or watching a movie that has me as the protagonist. It's less benign when we're talking about the media that we consume. Now, let's set aside for a moment the question of misinformation or disinformation online and assume that the what we just said about the swamp actually triggering a return to credibility for mainstream journalism is true. Nonetheless, there are going to be so many, and there are so many different slants and angles and things to be reported on, that the average person in the 7 or 8 minutes a day that they spend consuming the news is going to receive a very different snapshot that will be tailored to them by AI on the basis of what the AI knows engages them and makes them likely to click and swipe and like and comment and so on. What does the world look like when we're all walking around with our own individually tailored worldview?
Again, I think that undermines our society. We lose those common touch points that people, even today, I mean, the internet you see is unique to you. I see a completely different internet. The adverts I see are completely different. Even when I read an online newspaper, I'm seeing different stories because it's already making choices for me as the ones I tend to click on are the ones it's going to tend to put up first. All the prices I see on the internet are unique to me. You see different prices. People aren't really aware that the internet is just tailored to your preferences and tailored.
Did you see that scandal where there was I think it was an airline or a travel website that was providing different fares for people on Apple products than on PCs because Apple people have a higher income.
More for hotel rooms than people on PCs.
So search things on PCs.
Yeah.
Or in an incognito
hide
mode
behind
or
a
something.
VPN. So
yeah. Extraordinary. Okay.
And that, in terms of prices, that does undermine our sense of justice, right? We're used to walking down the high street and seeing a product for sale and thinking, well, anyone is allowed to walk in and buy it for that price. To realize that actually now most of the prices you see on the internet are ones that were chosen for you because they're the ones they think you're willing to pay that amount for it.
Extraordinary. So we all walk around with our own perception of what is, dramatic and important in the world. You only need to look at what has happened lately to the conversation around hot button issues, whether that's drag queens reading to children in libraries or pediatric transgender treatment or the climate crisis or, who is the real threat to democracy, woke people or the far right.
That's wonderful. I haven't heard about the drag queens, but presumably
you haven't heard that. You're living in a different bubble. This is a huge thing.
I'm in the bubble that tells you about all the tech challenges that I get all these tech stories thrown out to me, and that's the first time I can imagine.
I love that. It's a huge controversy about whether or not drag queens should be allowed to read. They call it Drag Queen Story Hour, and it's been going on for years where drag queens who are essentially clowns, right, at reading to kids and getting kids involved in reading. But you'll get the occasional viral video of some hypersexualized drag queen in some county in San Francisco where all the rainbow families have gathered together, and she's twerking or something, or she's got comically oversized breasts that she's rubbing in the children's faces. This goes viral and gets pushed by the right-wing media, and everyone in Missouri is horrified, and it becomes 2 weeks of talking point and becomes a really important thing that people think they need to be focusing on because the children are being corrupted, so save the children. So we all walk around with our own priority list, our own hierarchy of what ails the world. And if none of those lists intersect, how do we get on the same page to find common solutions to the problems that actually do ail us, like climate chaos and nuclear weapons and AI?
Yeah, I think you put your finger on a really important thing, which is that we will lose that collective society if we're all thinking about different things and we're not sharing those same cultural touch points, we're not sharing those same news touch points, that it will undermine the cohesion of our society, which requires us to, pretend that we're still back in the village and the town square that we used to be in.
Mm. Let's escalate to the next level of concern here, which is a word that I've heard you use, which I think is a wonderful word, serendipity. Let's set aside the challenge of misinformation and the challenge of receiving all of our news tailored to us and just talk about what it will be like. We're already seeing glimpses of this, to live in a world where all of our behaviour is essentially nudged into place by algorithms that know us better than we know ourselves, tailoring everything to our own whims. The current incarnations of this are the fact that the music you hear on Spotify, the television shows you watch on Netflix, the things the articles that are offered to you to read as you surf the web are all, and obviously the posts that you see on social media are all tailored to what they think is going to engage specifically you, this individualization of everything. Indeed, even dating now, where Tinder, you've called Tinder a sort of a vast genomic experiment in some ways, because we don't really know what. Well, explain that. I won't explain it for you.
What? We're handing over some of the most important decisions of our civilization, which is like who we procreate with, to algorithms. The majority of people now meet their spouse through one of these dating apps. And out of all the thousands, tens of thousands of profiles that you can be displayed, the algorithms are making the choice as to which ones you're going to see and therefore which ones you're going to swipe on. And that is introducing a different mixing into our gene pool. We used to be that we met the people who were friends of ours, who were in our immediate social circle, who were geographically close to us, or that we might, have bumped into in a bar. But now we're mixing the gene pool much more widely and on different criteria. The criteria being perhaps quite significantly more appearance-driven because they're, photographs on apps. And that's an interesting long-term experiment on the human gene pool. What are those, the next generation are decided by those matches and the genes that we then mix according to those matches. And so I don't think anyone thought, well, is this going to be a good impact? Or are we even allowed to talk about this? I mean, we're in dangerous territory now that's, verging on eugenics, where we're talking about, well, what is going to be the impact of allowing people to find their spouse and mate through algorithms as opposed to through the old-fashioned way, which was, did you talk to someone drunk in a bar? I mean, I'm not sure which was better, but it's going to be different, whatever it is.
It will be a different selection of chromosomes in either case.
And that's the future of the human race, being decided by those algorithms.
Yeah. And more so. And the algorithms will, those babies that get created through those Tinder hookups are going to procreate in a world in which who knows what the Tinder algorithm is going to be like, or the successor of Tinder is going to be like in 20 or 30 years. Right. So serendipity, I've heard you talk about that the sparkle in the eye of someone at the bar who may not have been someone you would necessarily select by swiping them on Tinder. They wouldn't have put together the perfect photo for you, but there's just something ineffable about them. It might be their pheromones, it might be the twinkle in their eye, whatever it is. The loss of that and the rise of us sitting alone in apartments, swiping desperately and chatting with people in text instead of face to face. What does that world look like? Is that set aside Tinder specifically, just the growth of all of my experiences being pre-selected for me by algorithms? What does that look like?
It's certainly a different world. I mean, it's not clear to me whether it's a better world or a worse world, in the sense that we're going to be, again, I come back to the phrase I used early on, which is we're going to be well entertained and we're going to be satiated, our desires are going to be met. But whether we're going to be challenged in the way that we are now, whether we're going to grow in the way that we are now, because life doesn't always have to be exactly that, the taste that we like. Sometimes it's good to be pushed in directions that at the first are not very comfortable.
And what do you say to people who say, look, I mean, this has always been the sort of evolution of humankind. You look back at photos of men commuting to work in the 1950s, and they were all sitting there on their trolleys and trams in suits reading newspapers. They were reading what they wanted to read. They weren't chatting to each other amicably. They weren't sparkling and twinkling in each other's eyes. They were heads down, just like we are now with our phones. And they were associating with their own cohort and reading their favourite newspaper and socialising with their favourite people and in their particular office.
Yeah, it's hard not to sound like an old fogey, but I remember I had a moment 10 years ago. I remember I went to Harvard and got the train from the airport, and I was sitting on the train, and I looked around, and it was full of young students at MIT and Harvard, so the cream of American intelligentsia, and I was the only person who had a book. Everyone else was on their phone scrolling, and I thought, what have we become? I mean, we're being entertained.
You do sound like an old fogey.
I know.
Yeah.
But this was 10 years ago. This was the intellectual population of the United States already just being entertained on their phones.
What's wrong with that?
Well, there are various different parts of there's the reptilian part of our brain that just wants to be amused and satiated, and then there's the cognitive part of our brains that want to be stimulated and if we want to grow as a society, I think we have to stretch ourselves in those directions.
Is boredom essential?
Yes. That's one of the greatest gifts I think you can give your children is to allow them to be bored, to give them time to be bored. I remember as a child being bored lots of the time. And that encourages you to, well, first of all, to be happy in yourself, but equally to go off and be more creative. You don't have to be eternally stimulated by the latest Hollywood blockbuster, but the simple things that will actually ultimately, I think, give us greater pleasure in the longer term.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Harvard train because, as you know, I spent most of my professional life in New York City, and I remember vividly when the New York subway brought in mobile phone reception on the subway, because my commute had previously been underground, and phones didn't work, and so it was wonderful. You'd sit there and you'd stare at other people's faces, and they'd pretend not to be staring at you, and people would, pretend to look at their shoes, or people would read books, or someone would do a dance in the subway car, and
it's all human psychology on the New York subway.
On the New York subway, it's a zoo, and then overnight, click of the fingers, they introduce mobile phone reception, and it all dies. Everyone's staring down into their own universe of entertainment. Wouldn't be able to tell you what the person sitting next to them looks like, whereas the day before they would have. It's doing something.
Yes. I'm not sure whether it's contributing to the polarization that we see within our society, the dysfunction that we start to see, that we're not understanding each other anymore because we're losing these shared values. We're losing these cultural touch points. We're off in our own little worlds.
Is there an optimistic take here akin to the optimistic spin that you put on the tsunami of bullshit, in that maybe we're just at a point where the machines aren't really good enough to give us fulfillment, and they're selecting for the wrong kinds of novelty, and they're essentially feeding us intellectual fast food. But could we imagine...
There are hints of that. So, for example, Amazon have opened a real-world store because, they are the world's store online, but they were discovering that they weren't learning people's real preferences because people would just go type in what they want and buy it.
Right.
And they weren't making all those serendipitous other purchases you would in a real store where as you go to the cash point, you see an object, you think, oh, I'll buy that. And so to get the data on what the other things that people might buy that they weren't finding online, Amazon has opened some stores. To get that data, they lose money on the stores.
Right, interesting.
And they're running the stores just to collect data so that they can offer you better choices as to, well, people who buy this product also buy this.
Right.
You might want to buy this. To get that data, they're willing to lose money on physical stores.
Interesting. I mean, one thing that I think is we're all going to be living with pretty soon that we'll look back on today and think it's incredible that we didn't have is an interaction with machines that are indistinguishable from humans, right? So that instead of having to type things in and having to talk to Siri in this kind of clunky way, or having to wait on hold to speak to an associate at a bank or an airline, all of those conversations will be automated, and we'll have machines doing at least as good a job, if not better, than the Indian call centres that we mostly communicate with no wait times. And I assume that I'll be able to talk to my phone and talk to systems without having the clutter of physical devices, that I'll just be sort of constantly interacting with intelligences that feel like they're conscious, even if they're not.
We'll come to a point where we walk in the room, we just say, lights on, turn the temperature.
Well, we're sort of already there, aren't we? Lights on.
And, who won the footy last night?
We won't even need to say lights on. The lights will just come on.
Yeah, the lights.
In fact, that's technology's been around for 40 years.
But, who won the footy last night? We just say it into the air. We expect something in the room is listening. We'll recognise our voice. We'll look up, which is our...
But I mean, more interesting would be, can you tell me, what can I cook for? What are a few things I could cook for dinner, given what's in the fridge? And it'll know what's in the fridge. It'll look at what's in the fridge.
We'll just say to the room those sorts of things, and it will say, you've got some eggs for an omelette, a few vegetables. You can make yourself a veggie omelette.
Yeah, and I'll talk you through the recipe.
Yeah.
If you don't know how to create a veggie omelette. Yeah, I'll turn the stove on. And I mean, it could be, you could walk in and it might notice that your vital signs are a bit stressed, and it might say, if you have any interest in going away this weekend, there's an Airbnb in the Blue Mountains.
Special offer for
in the Blue Mountains, which has a 40% discount on it. Do you want me to jump on it?
Which is in some sense our lives are going to be very much more convenient, and there's going to be less friction in our lives. But equally, if you were someone who was employed in one of those call centres, then you're going to have to say, well, wait a second, what happened to me? What happened to my job? I've been replaced, and what am I doing now?
Before we get to that dark, question about employment, can we just linger on the light one on the positive side of, does that level of sophistication mean that the zombified subway car of people gazing at their phones maybe goes away, and maybe people are still in some kind of AI world, but maybe they're not looking at a device. Maybe some people are listening to things. Maybe other people are looking at augmented reality version of the subway car. Maybe other people are, I don't know, being told a poem by their AI. I don't know if that's better or worse than the status quo.
Well, some people will be sitting there in their 3D world that's projected onto the front of their glasses, that they're in this metaverse virtual world that doesn't exist other than in their glasses.
And what do you think about the consequences then for employment? I mean, I hear one half of people say this is going to decimate people's lives, and there are going to be so many people out of work. And then I hear other people say, well, there have always been revolutions in the workforce, and people will do what the people who harpooned whales did when that was out of work. They'll find another line of employment.
I think the honest answer is we have no idea. We have absolutely no idea what the balance is going to be, whether more jobs get created than destroyed. And we're absolutely certain it's going to be disruptive. I mean, there's no doubt at all. Some jobs are going to disappear completely.
And probably more disruptive than any previous era, at least since perhaps the Industrial Revolution.
I think it's going to be more disruptive in terms of the speed. It's going to happen quicker, right? So if you think about, we've had other disruptions to the way that employment worked. The Industrial Revolution was one of those where we stopped farming and most of us were employed in agriculture. Now 3% of us are employed in agriculture. But that happened slowly. It took 50 odd years for the Industrial Revolution to percolate around the world. Equally, the internet, the internet again happened slowly. We had to plumb the world with the internet before it actually started to be useful. But in this case, this revolution, we put the plumbing in already. So it's going to happen overnight. And that's why, for example, ChatGPT was the fastest growing app ever. It's in less than 6 months, it's in the hands of over a billion people. So I think, if anything, the thing that's going to challenge us is the speed. It's going to happen so quickly.
It's going to be also interesting, the white-collar classes have been perhaps shamefully sanguine about truck drivers and checkout cashiers losing their jobs. But once it comes for the rest of us, and as you mentioned earlier, radiologists are doing a poorer job than AI is at spotting cancers on X-rays of lungs, and so many other professions get swept aside, then it'll be interesting what the dynamic is there in terms of the political and cultural and social upheaval.
Yeah, you're right, and I think people got the wrong idea. They thought that blue collar was the most at risk and white collar was least at risk, and in fact, actually, probably the opposite. That there are many places, many blue collar jobs, which are either too lowly paid to be worth replacing you with some automation, or too fiddly. There's still robots are still expensive, difficult objects to build. Whereas knowledge work is easy to replace. And so
become a plumber or a nurse.
Yeah, plumbers are going to exist. I mean, one of the safest professions that's going to exist for hundreds of years into the future is being a plumber, right? So you're going to pay someone extra to come in and fix those leaking pipes pronto. Robots aren't going to do that very easily, very well, or certainly cheaply enough. Whereas, as you say, being a radiologist, well, we already trained algorithms to read X-rays more reliably, more quickly than humans could do.
And this is not wholly a bad thing. I mean, I've done stories on my radio show about regional centres in Australia, which has a unique challenge with healthcare because it's the same size as the contiguous United States, but has the population of Florida huddled on largely just the southeast coastline, and so you've got these enormous distances with small populations scattered around. And this was a story about how AI radiology is being used, and telehealth, so that you can spot things that can then be verified by a human being in one of the capital cities. But they're bringing services to people that would never be possible if you were relying on a human being, because AI can do it. So that's good. That's saving people's lives. It's putting radiologists out of work, but it's potentially saving people's lives.
I don't think any radiologists have been put out of work yet.
It will.
Possibly. I mean,
why wouldn't it?
Well, at the moment, there's a shortage of radiologists. So
why aren't we using AI?
We're starting to use AI. So for example, the trials on place now, for example, if you go and have a breast mammogram, it's read by 2 doctors. Well, if you can replace one of those doctors by an AI, right? And the idea is if the 2 doctors agree, you've not got breast cancer, or if the 2 doctors agree you've got breast cancer, then that's the conclusion. If they disagree, then of course then they go and look more carefully at what's going on here, right? So if you can replace one of those doctors by an AI, which is just checking, in other words, what the human radiologist has said, you can double the throughput, and so you can now have twice the number of women have breast scans, and so spot more breast cancer.
Interesting. All right, let's escalate to the worst case scenario, which is on a lot of people's minds, which is like an existential threat that AI could go rogue. What do people mean when they talk about an alignment problem here is probably a place to start.
So this is the problem, that if we're going to build really intelligent, much more intelligent maybe than us machines, then we have to align their values with human values. We have to make sure that they go off and do things that are in humanity's interest. And how do we do that? That's actually quite an interesting challenge.
Why is it not as simple as saying, don't hurt people, do what we say?
Well, it's very hard to specify exactly what it means to don't hurt people, right? So, for example, you might say to the AI, can you eliminate cancer from the world? That would be a great thing to do, right? So go off and eliminate cancer from the world. And the AI says, okay, humans, I've worked out how to eliminate cancer from the world. I'm going to kill every one of you.
Or at least everyone with cancer.
Because then there will be no more cancer in the world.
Yeah, but that assumes that you haven't put in line 1, which is don't hurt people.
But even don't hurt people, right? There's lots of places where there is no solution that doesn't hurt people. It's all about trade-offs.
Right.
Right.
So it would be paralyzed from doing anything if it had to slavishly obey such a command.
It's very hard to specify, what are the actual goals that can't be misinterpreted and that don't have unexpected consequences. And in some sense, we already have this problem. Right? We already see the value alignment problem, which is with the superintelligence. So the superintelligence that already exists is the superintelligence you find in a modern day corporation. So no one on the planet knows how to build an iPhone. No one on the planet knows how to build a nuclear power station. But the employees of Apple and the employees of General Electric collectively between them have the collective intelligence, superintelligence, to be able to do those things.
Well, the employees of Apple probably don't, but the employees of their subsidiary in Shenzhen, right, which actually puts the phones together, probably knows more than the Apple.
They include all their supply chain, right? Yeah. Between them, collectively, there is the intelligence to be able to do those things, but it doesn't reside in one person. And then so we can perhaps entertain the idea that there is a greater than human intelligence that resides within those corporations, within the collective expertise of those corporations. But we already have the problem that those corporations are not aligned to humanity's survival. Just look at what big oil has done for the last 50 years. The climate emergency is a direct consequence of the fact that for 50 years now we've known this is happening. And it's been very well known to the scientists of these corporations that this was going to happen, and they've chosen, nothing was done about it. Their values were to maximize shareholder value, which they have done very successfully. And so we now have to ask the question: well, how do we align the values of those corporations, or how do we align the values of our superintelligence to be more closely aligned with those of the flourishing of humanity?
Right. What's a scenario? Can you give us a specific? Because I think people sometimes lose the thread, including myself here, about, so what is the disaster scenario in which, an AI that can do as much thinking in a second as I can do in 10,000 years is tasked with solving the problems of climate chaos and pandemics, sees some vision that is so sophisticated it's impossible to articulate to our puny human minds, and starts undertaking that. Like, a lot of people say, well, turn it off, tell it to stop doing that, embed an override in it. It doesn't have arms. What does it do? What is this existential end game that people are worried about?
Well, yeah, it doesn't have arms, but we've already got to a point where we can't turn the systems off. We're totally dependent upon computer systems in our lives now.
Because switching off the internet would switch off our hospitals and water supply,
electricity grid, right. Air traffic control, you name it. It's not surprising. When the internet goes down, most businesses tell people to go home. Right? That's it. There's nothing we can do anymore.
Right.
It's so integral to our lives, right? So we're not in a position where really we can turn.
And we're not even testing AI in secure situations where it's not connected to the internet. I mean, we're literally testing it on the internet and giving it to everybody now, and it's learning on the web. So if there was ever a chance to quarantine it and not let it out of the box, I assume that's passed. I mean, ChatGPT is already on the web.
It's already on the web. It's already doing stuff. People already giving it agency to do stuff. And we've seen, we do have examples already of how we give some agency to the algorithms and things go terribly wrong. So In particular, I'm thinking of the stock market. So we've got stock market now, many share transactions are not decided by humans, they're decided by fast trading algorithms. And every now and again, it goes wrong. Every now and again, there's a flash crash. And we've realized that's going to continue to happen. We don't know why it happens. We don't know how to fix it. So they put circuit breakers in and they say, okay, stop everything. We have a record, unfortunately, of all the transactions. Let's just unwind everything, give everyone back their money and say none of what happened in the last hour happened. Let's begin again. But if those weren't algorithms that were sitting on the stock market, but algorithms that were sitting on the DMZ between North and South Korea, maybe you've created a flash war and the nuclear missiles are on their way and you can't unkill the people you've just killed.
Right. That's an example of a glitch. Is there an example of a more conniving AI strategy? I mean, is there an example? Because I listen to Eliezer Yudkowsky or people who are the real Chicken Littles here who feel like it is foolish to bring into existence, to give birth to a system that is as much more intelligent than we are, than a dog, and expect that it isn't going to develop priorities of its own that do not treat our interests as sacrosanct. So we're opening a portal and something's coming out of it, and we don't understand how to control that.
Well, I think really we come back to the conversation we had at the start, which is whether these machines will have any sentience, consciousness.
Do they need to in order to connive, in order to manipulate?
If they have, then you can start. It's certainly plausible then to consider that maybe they're going to have goals of their own. They're going to have survival instincts of their own, just like you and I have survival instincts to keep our consciousness alive. Right,
but a humanoid robot could also have survival instincts. Like you don't need our lights to be on.
You don't.
For us to behave the way we do.
It would make sense to actually program those into machines, right? So they're going to help those machines avoid hurting themselves. You want to program them with something, like a survival instinct, which is, don't allow your hand to be crushed in the door, or don't allow don't allow accidents to happen to you, and that will allow the machine to survive. So they're sorts of instincts that we would want to program, even if they don't occur.
So setting aside the question of whether or not the AI becomes intelligent, do you give any credence to the fear that a system sufficiently advanced, sufficiently intelligent, sufficiently strategic could manipulate humans, manipulate civilization, manipulate our information flow in order to achieve aims that it thinks that we're too stupid to, I say thinks in quotation marks, right? It's not doing any thinking. But you can imagine I can imagine myself in relation to a dog in doing things that I think are in the dog's interest, or in the interest of all dogs, that my dog might not think that it wants me to do. Get it to take medicine, for example, and it lands for the dog as being abuse, but I know better. Do you envisage a scenario in which...
Well, dogs have done quite well out of their relationships with more intelligent humans.
This is true.
They've actually played us very well. I do sometimes wonder if you ask a bunch of really intelligent people like my colleagues about, what's the most important value you have, they say intelligence. And they're worried about an excess of it. I've hung around a few politicians and think probably a bit more intelligence around the politicians which would be a good thing. It's not intelligence, that I think is the worrying thing. It's power. Who is given the power to do things? And maybe there's a little bit of hope, a little bit of me that hopes that with intelligence might come some wisdom, and that we would have to be less worried about, the more intelligent my car is, my self-driving car, the happier I'm going to be. It's going to be smarter, avoiding accidents and thinking ahead. So I don't think, intelligence in my car seems to be a particularly bad thing. It's when I give the car the permission, the power to be able to impact other parts of my life, I start to worry. But intelligence per se, I don't see as being that problematic.
Right. Interesting. So, well, let's end on that then. When my children, who are currently 5, are your age, let's assume that the world is full of vastly more intelligence than it currently has right now. We have artificial systems that are capable of piecing together strategies that nobody can comprehend currently. Are you an optimist or a pessimist or a little of both about what that world looks like?
Oh, I'm definitely a glass half full person at that point. I mean, I do think the next 20 or 30 years are going to be pretty painful. I think we've put ourselves in a pretty unique position in the history of humanity, which is that we have gifted our children a worse planet, guaranteed. And that hasn't ever been true before now. Every generation has inherited a slightly better planet, and we've managed to reverse that course.
Well, in 1910, were people who were born in 1900.
Well, technology was coming along, life expectancy.
World War I, World War II, the Holocaust.
Of course.
Passchendaele.
The
Great Depression.
History has, there have been some events on top which have changed our lives. But if you look at the grand course of history, you look at life expectancy, you look at median income. Since the Industrial Revolution, even in Australia, life expectancy's doubled. We used to die in our 40s, now we die in our 80s. We live like kings and queens. We have machines that wash our clothes, wash our dishes. Those are things that we used to have servants for. So we have overall, I mean, you're right, there have been some blips of First World War or the Great Depression. It hasn't been strictly one way. But overall, the general trend has been for life to get better, and technology has driven that. It has been technology that's driven it. And in the last 50 years, it's been computing. And that's the productivity gains, the growth in our economy has been driven by the digital revolution. So I'm optimistic in the sense that we will continue that progress. But just like, as you say, the First World War made things worse, we have guaranteed ourselves 10 or 20 years of pain as we have to work our way through the climate emergency, increasing inequality, the polarization of our political discourse. Who would imagine, we're fighting wars again in Europe? The global insecurity, the tensions that we see, those are challenging problems. I'm pretty optimistic, though, in the sense of if we get through the next 20 or 30 years, then it will be a better planet, and technology, AI in particular, will be helping us to live better, longer, healthier, hopefully happier life.
All right, hang in there, humankind. You heard it here from Toby Walsh. There's sunshine and lollipops and milk and honey on the other side of the abyss. Thank you, Toby. Great to talk to you.
My pleasure.